Good afternoon, everyone. Happy November. Welcome to the 2018 Deloitte-NASCIO Cyber Study highlight webinar. I'm Meredith Ward with NASCIO. I'm just going to be doing some introductions today and then turn it over to the fine folks who will be talking to you. So today we are happy to have some great outside speakers and one of our very own. Debbie Blythe, a CISO from the state of Colorado, will be with us today and giving insights from her extensive background and experience. Srini Subramanian with Deloitte is going to go over a lot of the data from the study. And then our very own Doug Robinson, Executive Director, is going to moderate today. So with that, I will turn it over to Doug.
Meredith, thank you, and welcome all of our attendees to our biennial webinar on our cybersecurity study. And so let me start out by overviewing a quick timeline here of our States at Risk series. And as you can see from the colorful slides of our cover art since 2010, we've been producing a series that really is important because it has the context of longitudinal data. We've got some of the same question sets from 2010. And so with that, we've been able to measure some progress. Measured progress is certainly a term we would use because in some cases we've seen almost a steady state, and we're going to talk about that today as we kind of look at the highlights from the 2018 study. But I think it also represents a significant turnover from 2010 in the role of Chief Information Security Officer in the States. We have probably less than 5 CISOs still in office that responded to the 2010 survey. So we see quite a turnover, and we can certainly talk about that when we get to the talent issue. But that's one of certainly the topics that we discuss on a biennial basis is the talent crisis in the state cybersecurity world, particularly the leadership position of the CISO. So we want to certainly talk about that a little bit today. So if we could, let's look at the methodology for our survey, which has been consistent again since 2010. We are surveying U.S. state and territorial enterprise level Chief Information Security Officers. Again, these are the security officers that report to the state CIO. They are in almost every case in the state CIO office. In a couple of places, there's a little bit different organizational model, but fairly equivalent. They had a very robust set of questions that they answered this year, 56 questions. And again, it looks at enterprise level cybersecurity, it looks at initiatives, it looks at governance, it looks at operational integration, what's taking place in the states, and the importance of cybersecurity. Survey responses were received from 50 states this year, quite a remarkable response rate. So we have a great set of data to talk about today, and we'll get into the details here in just a few moments. If we could, let's look at our agenda and our overview for today's webinar. Fairly straightforward. We're going to talk about the CISOs now having an executive platform that really relates to the communication opportunities that they have in terms of both the executive and the legislative branch and other business stakeholders. We're going to talk about some of the persistent challenges. And again, as I mentioned, with the longitudinal data we have, and particularly looking at the 2016 baseline, where we saw some significant progress from 14 to 16 in a number of categories, we haven't seen that same progress at the same level between 16 and 18. So we want to address that and talk about it. We're going to articulate some bold plays because we believe with that kind of steady state that we've seen for the last 2 years, the states really need bold actions to accelerate change. We've suggested 3 that we believe the states should take, and we'll get into the details of those and the rationale behind those. You're going to see a lot of the detailed data behind that. And I think it's important to provide that, but we're not going to overwhelm you with all the data sets. We've done a little bit of a selection, again, to highlight those key areas that we think of important and get some color commentary from both Debbie and Srini. And Debbie, as a practitioner and in the trenches and a respondent to the survey for the last several years, has a unique perspective to provide us with her insights about not only the data that we're going to see, but also the use of the survey. And I should mention, I think the important piece of this study each year as we come out with the survey results, it is not only a set of empirical data and probably the most, I think, preeminent report looking at state cybersecurity from multiple dimensions, it's also a major advocacy piece and is used by state CIOs, state CISOs, and other state leaders to advocate, and because they have a baseline that they can compare themselves against the other states and look at the national aggregate data, because we're only reporting that aggregate data in the report, but it gives everyone a really good snapshot of what's taking place in cybersecurity in the states on some key areas that aren't covered in other surveys. So with that, we're going to go ahead and move on to the first topic, which is, I mentioned CISOs have an executive leadership platform, and I think we've got some of the data in front of us. So I'm going to turn this over to Srini for some explanatory notes about what's going on with CISO authority in the states today. Srini?
Thank you, Doug. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to some of those in the West Coast. As we talk about the CISOs have an executive platform, maybe I'll just start thanking every one of the 50 state chief information security officers for responding to the survey. I think your commitment in terms of taking the time to find the answers at an enterprise level and submit the responses promptly since 2010 has been an hallmark for this particular survey. So thank you for it. And on that note, maybe I'll start with the first chart and maybe orient the listeners on the slides. So each one of the slides is going to have, particularly with the data charts, is going to follow a similar model. At the bottom of the slide, you have the survey question that we really asked for the respondents. And at the top, title as well as the subtitle are main takeaways from the data. And then you also have very detailed level data on various categories, and also comparison with the prior years. And you will see the legend in different color-coded legends. And so just follow along. And I do not plan to go over every one of the detailed data on the chart, but really stick to the key takeaways. So the first point on this slide is that every one of the states have a chief information security officer position, and this position is gaining an executive platform much more so than ever before. So why do I say that? For example, if you look at the first row, the authority for the CISO is now increasingly being established by a statute or law. In other words, there is a legislative action that puts the authority for the state CISOs more than ever before. And so the CISO role is definitely something that everyone is familiar more than the technology arm of the state. And so the CISOs are gaining that platform. Now, if you go to the next slide, now, they're also improving the reporting cadence to the state leadership. Now, this is, again, a consequence of CISOs gaining that visibility at the executive level, both with the governors and the legislature. So, for example, if I just look at the state governors, the reporting frequency on a regular basis, either it is monthly, quarterly, or annually, almost 24 state CISOs are reporting on a regular basis on cyber risk to the state governors. And similarly, reporting on cyber risk to the state legislature has increased from 2016 as well. So a combination of reporting relationships as well as the fact that the authority is increasingly being established by legislature is really putting or giving the CISOs an executive platform through which they should be able to make some big changes. If you go to the next slide.
Hey, Srini, I just wanted to mention something real quick here. I saw an article that 21 of our states have new governors this year or coming up this year. And I think that may present an opportunity to us, maybe if we haven't been able to get the ear of the prior governor, this may be an opportunity to kind of start in with a new governor and sort of increase that frequency of reporting.
Deborah, excellent point you bring up. I mean, particularly for those states who are still reporting to the governors on an ad hoc basis, this presents an excellent opportunity to set up the cadence of regular reporting. very good point. Thank you for your comment.
Debbie, how would you describe your, lines of communication with the state legislature? Is that still ad hoc, or do you have a standing committee of jurisdiction, perhaps, that you can speak to on a regular basis? How has that worked in Colorado?
Sure. So in Colorado, we have a joint technology committee, and I would say I present to them at least a couple of times a year. We also have a legislative audit committee, and I present to them mainly as a result of various audits that they perform. But I also present to them a couple of times a year. But we definitely look for kind of those regular opportunities, because when I go ask for funding, I really need the Joint Technology Committee to kind of be on board. And so it's very helpful for they're familiar with my program, the more they can help me, help support me in that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a good tie-in. We'll talk later in the webinar today about the funding and the request for funding. So that's a good tie-in to that conversation. So Srini, let's go ahead and look at the top challenges that remain after several years.
Yes, thank you, Doug. So if you look at the chart here, so while the CISOs are starting to enjoy an executive platform, and the executive leadership who are starting to listen to them, when we look at the barriers, the budget, talent, and the sophistication of threats have consistently remained as a top barrier since 2010. I mean, particularly if you look at the lack of budget for the CISOs, this has been the top barrier since 2010, unchanged. And the talent denoted by some missing people in the org chart has been the second topmost barrier in the last two of our surveys, and really exchanging position with the increasing sophistication of threats. And that the consistently remaining barriers is one of the things that we thought about when we were analyzing the results, that now that CISOs have an executive platform, what can the CISOs do to really make some significant improvements in the upcoming years? And that's really the genesis of maybe thinking about bold place, and particularly the remaining status quo in terms of the challenges is what drove that thinking.
Srini, if I could, let me provide a perspective from the state CIOs. So kind of in order to get a comparison between these two, we asked almost an identical question this year in our state CIO survey, and we've asked it in previous years, but we decided to kind of look at the compare and contrast. So what's interesting from the state CIO perspective is they see the increasing sophistication of the threats as the major barrier. That's the top challenge that they see, followed by inability to attract and retain cybersecurity talent. And third, the lack of adequate funding. So I guess where you stand depends on where you sit, but the CISOs clearly see, since it's their budget, they would like increased the funding issues, where just about half of the CIOs thought that it was the major barriers. So a little bit difference of opinion between those two leadership positions. And again, in all the states, for the most part, the CISO is trying to advocate to the CIO and others for that increased budget. So it does challenge us a little bit to think about, in the future, how to address the budget gaps while there isn't necessarily a pure alignment between the CIO and the CISO and kind of that thinking. So it really does demand, as you said, some kind of bold action. So we need to kind of address those as well today.
Very good. Well, as we move into the bold place or bold actions, so the summary of the top level finding is that there is an executive platform. The top level challenges persist. And Deborah, before I go into the more of the details, I just wanted to ask for the benefit of the other CISOs on the line, how do you use the results of this report? I mean, are you able to take it and talk to the executive leadership about the findings at an aggregate level?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, this report is probably the most important report that I refer to in almost every single one of my presentations, because I'm able to show, like I was very proud to show it to state legislature and show them how their support of my program and their support of increasing my funding steadily year over year put me in the top 20% of best funded states in the nation. And the way that I was able to support that was to basically point to the results of this report from 2 years ago. And so I use it quite a bit because, even when I was in the private sector, a lot of times when I went and, proposed some changes to the security program, my leadership would say to me, well, what are our competitors doing? And it was impossible to go get that type of information. But with this report, this is probably the most important report that I can refer to, because this is exactly what every state in the nation is doing and how their cybersecurity program is stacking up against mine. And so I find it extremely valuable.
Well, thank you, Debbie. I think that gives a context in terms of some of the other data points that are coming in. I mean, particularly as we talk about the challenges. So, would love to hear your point of view on your state, as well as some of the bold plays that we are suggesting here. If you can go to the next slide. If you can go to the next slide. So what are the bold plays that are going to be needed? We talked quite a bit about the budget challenge. So the data shows looking since 2010, but really focusing on the last two biennial reports. Since 2016, there is a certain level of improvement or increase in cybersecurity budgets, but it is growing very slowly. If you see the middle columns, most of the states are still stagnating in terms of they are showing stagnation from a budget point of view, and even the states that are showing increase, only 7 states have shown an increase of over 10% in the budget. And if you look at the next slide, which is really the representation of cybersecurity budget as a percentage of the overall technology spend. Now, we have been tracking this since 2010, and there is really no magic number, and Doug would talk quite a bit about that, since it is not like when we reach a certain percentage of the technology spend, cybersecurity risks are going to be addressed. But however, it gives us a metric in terms of how the states are progressing in this particular front. Now, if you look at that budget, most of the states are in the 0 to 3% of the overall technology budget. And the third point is related to having the visibility for the state budget in the overall technology or overall budget. And most of the states, almost 50% of the states, do not have visibility to cybersecurity in their budget, whether it is in the technology or otherwise. And then then we also took the step of looking and comparing the state-level budgets with the federal agencies. Now, arguably, the federal defense agencies, Department of Defense and Department of Homeland Security and so forth, have to spend a lot more on cybersecurity because of the national defense imperative that they carry. So we really looked at the civil agencies. You see 5 of them here, and looked at their cybersecurity as a percentage of technology, as well as their year-over-year increase in cybersecurity budget. So really 2 takeaways from this slide. One is the federal government the federal legislation required every single federal agency to report their cybersecurity as a line item that's visible outside of their technology budget. And that visibility seems to have helped. While the federal agencies still carry cyber risks, having that visibility and having that published as part of the White House budget seems to have helped. And the federal agencies certainly seem to be enjoying much more of the the percentage of technology spend, as well as some agencies are seeing a good year-over-year increase in cyber budget as well. And compared to this, when some of the research analyst reports, which typically had pegged the percentage of technology spend for cyber to be in the 8 to 15% range, one of the research analyst report in 2015, which focused only on the organizations in U.S., had actually put it up as high as 28%. Now, the last data point, if you go to the next slide, is related to the effectiveness of cybersecurity initiatives. Now, it's not a surprise to see that the effectiveness improves dramatically when the regulations and requirements come with commitment of funding. The example here is the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services from the federal agency that had the requirements, cyber requirements, called minimum acceptable risk for exchanges or minimum acceptable risk standards for exchanges, MARSI. The state level Health and Human Services really benefited from implementing those cyber requirements and actually getting funding from the federal agencies. So the inference is that the cybersecurity initiatives can be much more effective with funding commitment. Really gets us into the ball play number one territory of states looking for a dedicated cyber program funding, as well as looking to seek additional assistance from federal agencies that are imposing requirements. I've probably spoken a lot, but let me turn it over to Doug.
Yes, yeah, thanks, Srini. And I'm going to really ask for some comments from Debbie about her advocacy for dedicated funding and even dedicated initiatives. But I think and in the context here, I think it's important to recognize that there's no one silver bullet. We talk about the funding being commensurate with the risk and cybersecurity being a business risk in the states. And with that, it really should, as in the private sector, simply get higher visibility. It should be easily identifiable. It is not today. In most states, it's difficult to determine what their funding is. It's often difficult to determine what their total IT funding is. But certainly from the federal side, we know, including the DHS and DOD, that with about an $84 billion spend this year on IT, they're spending about 16% of that $84 billion on cybersecurity. So we know that's much, much higher than any state, but we're not suggesting that states have a magic number, because I think I hear that from executives, from governors, from legislators. They want to know, Doug, what should we spend? I said, you should look at this as your top priority of your CIO, which is cybersecurity, and determine what's commensurate with the level of risk that you face. So let's turn it over to Debbie, because she's on the ground and she's having to do this and advocate for this, and has an understanding from the state of Colorado. So Debbie, I'm interested in your perspective on, getting dedicated cyber funding, or what you've done to try to advance the cause in your funding area in Colorado.
Yeah, sure. I think one thing that has been really helpful for the state of Colorado is we have a approved cybersecurity strategic plan in place. That was established back in like 2012 or 2013, that once we put that in place, we set some goals around funding, and that helped us to get the very first, for our state, the very first budget line item for cybersecurity. And it started out pretty meager, and we understood that it would start meager, and we set a goal saying we would like to get to 5% of IT statewide spend, and we will track and report on this over time. And so I think, anything that we've seen with other types of metrics is you can't improve something that you're not tracking. And so when you start out with, a line item and you say, okay, we're less than 1% of overall statewide spend, people look at that and then they look at your goal and they say, well, gosh, we aren't even close. And so they can kind of help. Certainly when I think about the legislature and the governor and the support that we've had, being able to track and say, here's where we're at, and then show them a goal, and certainly using a lot of the industry benchmarks, like Srini was pointing out to us, is really helpful to be able to say, here's how federal agencies are funding, here's how other states are funding, here's where we're at. And that for us has been very, very successful in improving that metric over time and getting us up closer to where we are or where we want to be. And one of the things that I've noticed is you actually added a new category this year for states that are funding their cybersecurity programs at more than 6% of the overall statewide spend. And that was really, really exciting to me because I was really excited to be able to point to that and say, hey, there are other states that are better funded than we are, and maybe we should adjust our goal. So I found it very helpful.
Very good. Srini, let's move on to kind of looking at top cybersecurity initiatives and have a little bit deeper discussion about kind of enabling innovation within the enterprise as a driver of security.
Certainly, Doug. So the next area of data points relates to the top cybersecurity initiatives. Now, on the left-hand side of the slide, you see what came out as the top 5 cybersecurity initiatives from all of the states responding to the study. Now, there is no surprise here, right? Like risk assessments, metrics, training awareness, strategy, and cloud platform security. All of these are necessary things that the CISOs must do and must be part of their day-to-day operations as well as strategy, and the CISOs are rightfully spending their time focusing on that. Now, on the contrasting that, on the right-hand side is a list of responses from the CISOs related to what people would call as like innovation type activities and the innovation areas like the citizen digital identity, Internet of Things, blockchain, smart government, and those didn't really appear in even in one of the 5 top initiatives. And while the CISOs must do whatever appears on the left, now with considering that they are starting to get an executive platform, should they be delegating some of these to their deputies and really looking to say, how do I take and promote the innovation initiatives for the state and be at the forefront of innovation? And that looking at that almost as a role of the CISOs to be an enabler of innovation is the next bold play that we show on slide number 2. During the annual conference, when we talked about it, Illinois CIO Kirk Lonborn really talked about 5 stages of CISO as an enabler of innovation, like starting with the CISOs being a stopper of anything new technology, new initiative, and having a 5-grade scale as a speed bump, collaborator, accelerator, and eventually to an enabler, like almost a 5-point maturity scale of how can CISOs look at themselves as getting to be an enabler of innovation. Back to you, Doug.
Yes, and I think this goes with the changing role of the CISO that we've seen, and what I discussed initially about the ongoing maturity that we've seen, Srini. And early on, I think many CISOs had the wonderful nickname of Dr. No, and they were known around the state IT enterprise as really kind of blocking innovation, blocking new technologies, even kind of basic connectivity because they were concerned about the security. I think what's interesting about looking at the data is when you compare and contrast with the state CIO view on what they believe to be the most impactful emerging technology in the next 3 to 5 years, 57% of our CIOs said it's going to be artificial intelligence, robotic process automation, a major jump and really a flip from IoT in 2017. So we've put out already a policy brief on artificial intelligence. We spoke about it at the conference. We're seeing a state adoption of AI and robotic process automation. Again, these are more opportunities for risk, but I think the benefit, we're seeing the risk-reward benefit there in terms of what states can do. So I think it really is incumbent upon the state CISO to really look at their role in this and try to find out how they can enable this innovation. So I'm interested in Debbie's comments about her role in the state, because I know Colorado has also embarked on a number of these initiatives. So Debbie, what do you say about bold play number 2?
Yeah, I love the idea, and we've got a member of our team who is just very innovative, and he was, first to try to bring innovation into security by looking at things like better ways to layer in two-factor authentication that made it more user-friendly, and also, better ways to adopt cloud services in a secure manner, putting standards in place and with training and those types of things, kind of getting out in front. And a couple of years ago, we were looking at probably more machine learning, but a little bit of automation as well, as far as how do we respond to threats and, even like malware in the environment. Is there a way that we can have analytics that would sort of find issues, bubble them up to the top of our list of issues, and then potentially add some automation that would go and help clean it up as well. So we've certainly been looking at all of that in the security space. But this year, the legislature actually passed legislation on blockchain and put a lot of emphasis on the use of blockchain to improve security. And so it kind of forced me into looking into blockchain, whether I was interested or not, and kind of forced us to be a little bit innovative and look for innovative ways to layer in blockchain in ways that make sense within our state. So I'm kind of excited about the opportunity to look at some of these new technologies. It almost gave me permission to go and spend some of my time on that.
Very good. Well, Srini, we've talked about the adequacy, competency, and of talent within the states for a number of years in our surveys. Continues to be a major challenge and really kind of one of the major barriers to progress. So let's review. We have carefully talked about the talent crisis. We use that word very carefully, but we believe that in today's environment, that's what we're facing in state government, with the inability to recruit, retain, attract, compensate cybersecurity talent to stay in state government. So we've got a lot of data from this year's survey, and I know it's a top issue for the CISO. So if you could go ahead and review that, we'll have some commentary about it.
Yes, certainly, Doug. So the chart that you see on the screen talks about the number of full-time equivalent FTEs at a state enterprise level. The current survey in 2018 shows that most of the states, almost 49% of the respondents, are saying that they have 6 to 15 FTEs, a certain improvement from what we had as an average in 2010, which was 1 to 5, but still a long way to go in terms of what some of the other industries are at. I mean, for instance, even in 2010, this is 8 years back, the financial services industry, corporations of similar size to a state government, had more than 100 FTEs doing cybersecurity type of work. And if you go to the next slide, this is really about the cyber competency gap. I mean, Doug, you mentioned about the talent being a crisis, and we continue to see that more than 50% of the state CISOs believe that their cyber team has gaps in competencies that they would like to see. And if you go to the next slide, and why is this crisis continuing? And really, the top barriers for the states to be able to hire, develop, and retain cyber talent. The top barriers, the top one is the state compensation model for cybersecurity professionals. I mean, that really is at the top of the chart, and followed by workforce leaving for private sector careers or federal agencies, and then lack of qualified candidates in the cities where state capitals are located, which in most instances are also not the biggest cities of that state. So a number of challenges in terms of attracting and retaining talent. And then going to the next slide, this is the last chart on this section. So how are the states mitigating some of these talent-related challenges? And one of them could be outsourcing of certain chosen cyber functions to private sector and partnering with the private sectors to be able to do that. And when in this particular chart, we actually did the comparison with 2010 data. And while we see a good amount of increase from the outsourcing of certain cyber functions since 2010, still more than 50% of the states, or more than half of the states, are not outsourcing each of these functions. So there seems to be an opportunity to potentially partner with or team with private sector and really hold the private sector accountable for service levels of certain chosen cyber functions, but also require the private sector to be able to keep up with their talent that is supporting the state. Really gives way to the bold play number 3 of teaming with the private sector and higher education to be able to overcome the talent-related challenges.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Srini, I think this is in line, as we try to talk about the details behind bold play number 3, in line with, again, the continuing and evolving business models that we talk about with the states and state IT, and that is one where we're seeing kind of the devolution of what we call the owner-operator model, and much more involvement with private sector solution providers, particularly in the services area, managed services, outsourcing. We're seeing this on a regular growth path with the state CIOs and across the board with a number of services, and we would expect that to continue. The CIO as broker discussion and the multi-sourcing integration, we've described those, and we'll continue in our upcoming policy briefs to talk about that evolution, but we certainly see that playing out within the cybersecurity space. So I guess as we talk about bold play number 3 and teaming with the private sector, I'm interested in Debbie's comments about what they may have done, particularly with private sector solution providers and outsourcing certain managed services for security. What have you done in Colorado, Debbie?
Yeah, I'm almost ashamed to tell you that I fall into that 50% of states who have not outsourced these functions. However, I so appreciate you digging into this because I think it is so relevant, and we almost looked at it as a failure when within our security operations center, we were having such a hard time keeping the team staffed and handling the workload until we finally said we're going to have to get a managed security services provider in here to help us with some of this work so that we can, more appropriately utilize the resources that we have. And so we almost looked at it as our own failure. And now as I look at these results, I think, well, heck, actually, what I should be saying is this is strategic for us, and we will strategically outsource where it makes sense and embrace the private sector's capability to provide some of these functions that we're having a hard time sourcing. So, so I think, it's very helpful to me to know that half of my peers are already in this, have gone down this road, and that's been accepted in their states. And, we can continue to provide security services as a state, but we can strategically outsource those services that we've had some trouble providing. So, so that's kind of where we're at.
And one final, I guess, question in this bold play, which relates to the relationship, collaboration with higher education, particularly around talent. I know that in your organization, you have a fairly evolved talent development program in IT, but what have you done specifically in terms of higher education within the state? Formal collaborations, internships, mentorships, what have you taken on for cybersecurity?
Yeah, so all of that. Our governor started up something called the National Cybersecurity Center in Colorado and part of it is for workforce development. And so that's a very formal working together with higher education to make sure that the future cybersecurity workforce is developed appropriately to help us combat future cyber threats. Additionally, we partner very closely, my own organization partners very closely with local universities for training and for cybersecurity event, so like incident response, where we'll do simulated cyber scenarios. We've actually built out a replica of the Colorado network in a local university where we actually were able to bring in some of our teams, train on our, and then create a simulated security event in which we were able to utilize our tools to respond to that event. So that was kind of, training for us, training for them, and a good way for us to kind of get some assistance. This last year, we did something pretty unique to our state. Is we created a veterans internship program. We call it a veterans transition program, where we create about 10 paid internships for military veterans at a couple of levels. So some that have had prior cybersecurity and threat intelligence in the military, or others that have IT experience and sort of a propensity towards cybersecurity as well. And we're bringing them in, training them on our tools. It helps them augment their resumes with things that look more like the private sector to hopefully help them transition into their future career. But additionally, it's helped us to create a pipeline of talent for ourselves. And we've actually hired 4 of these veterans full-time into our program. And that has brought significant relief into our efforts in trying to staff some of these positions. We've got some great talent that came from a source we hadn't thought to look at before.
Now, very good.
That's
Again,
really,
there's some innovation from the states to address the talent situation, that's for sure. Okay. So there you have the 3 bold plays, a quick recap. So as we transition from the major points of the study into some more discrete topics, let me take this chance to do a blatant commercial message about getting your hands on a copy of the report. The PDF, the digital versions of the entire report are available both on the NASCIO and the Deloitte websites, and you can easily find those. In addition, a hashtag State of Cyber, you can find that as well, links across the Twitterverse. A webinar recording, this recording of this webinar will be available on the NASCIO website shortly. You'll be able to actually get a full set of the slides with the integrated recording, and you can share that with your colleagues for those who weren't able to attend live today. So with that, we've got a couple of discrete topics we want to talk about, and first is certainly one that gets a lot of attention, is what is the kind of the nature of the security threats from the standpoint and the view of the State Chief Information Security Officer, and what are some of the challenges that they are seeing. So we're going to ask Srini to kind of cover this quickly and then get some commentary from Debbie, her perspective in Colorado. So Srini, I'll let you take on security threats now.
Thank you, Doug. And we are diving a little bit deeper into some of the specific topic areas that we thought would be of interest to the webinar audience. So the first one is related to the security threats, and this is in response to the question of which is the area of the state that most of the threat seems to lie in. And the response seems to be pointing majorly towards the web applications, web-based applications, and malicious code seem to be the 2 of the top hitters. And if you go to the next slide, now we are also seeing.
Okay, go ahead, Srini. I wanted you to point out the respondents, I think, from 19 of the states that said, my state has not been breached. And so we believe that they misinterpreted the question because we believe the states have all been breached, but they just don't know it yet, right? So we may put an asterisk by that number right there.
And it could be the use of the word breach, where
right.
there were about 30 of us gathered a few months ago talking about what does breach mean, and we couldn't even seem to agree upon the definition between 30 of us state CISOs. So
right.
It could be that what they meant there is the state has not suffered an actual data breach where, the specific type of data falls into the specific legal category of breach, but it doesn't necessarily mean they haven't had a malware infection.
Correct. Yeah. So we Trini and I kind of talked about that semantics, and I think you're right. As they were believing we were talking specifically about data breaches, and really probably should have used security incident there. But anyway, that is definitely one area we'll have to look at for the next survey. All right.
Yeah, certainly. And no worries. And certainly, Debbie, what we will do is, because every one of these surveys, as you know, we have a CISO advisory committee that actually goes through the questions and advises us, and we will put that to get maybe more accurate representation for that results. But then when I compared the threats that seem to point to the web applications, we thought that we would take a look at how frequently are the states testing these applications, the application security testing specifically for vulnerabilities. And interestingly, while a number of states seem to be doing it on a monthly and quarterly basis, and the monthly frequency is improving, which is an encouraging sign, about 20 of the states still perform these tests on an ad hoc basis. So, which kind of tells us that while this is the top threat, the web-based applications, the states would also need to do a better job of maybe frequently testing them and making sure that they are not carrying vulnerabilities that could be exploited. And the next slide, the last one, is the ransomware, social engineering, and phishing, farming, and the variants of those seem to be the top in the list of all of the cyber threats. And thought that I'm sure, Deborah, you have some comments about all of these data related to security threats in general.
Yeah, and certainly as I looked at this slide, I thought, oh my goodness, yeah, ransomware. I have I have some experience with that because most of you have heard of the Colorado Department of Transportation incident that happened in February and March of this year. And certainly we'd seen ransomware at the state before, but, you know, we'd gotten it in onesie, twosies, or maybe up to 10 machines, and we'd been able to deal with it, not a big deal. But I had never seen it on the magnitude and the scale of which we had for CDOT earlier this year, where we had 1,300, almost 1,300 workstations, almost 400 servers. We had every single database, every single application that was affected for the Colorado Department of Transportation. And that was just huge. I mean, that's not just go and reimage. That's a little bit of a bigger issue. And I was really amazed at how impactful that was. It actually took CDOT's business operations down for an entire month while we looked to eradicate the malware, clean up all the holes, and then recover all the services. So that was a biggie.
Yeah, and Debbie, that is one, I guess, in terms of our commentary, advocacy that we have made from this survey and NASCIO in general for many years is cybersecurity demands an enterprise authority and enterprise oversight. And I think, you know, many of the incidents that we're seeing that are fairly dramatic in the states are at the agency level. And I think it, you know, behooves every state to kind of look at that and revisit, you know, what kind of accountability the agencies have, and also how they are complying with enterprise level policies and controls. And I think you're right to kind of look at that from the standpoint of a large organization like CDOT. And then that's always a challenge with states, because particularly the states that are federated or decentralized in some manner have those challenges. So, all right, Srini, if we could move on, because I know we've got a couple of questions that I think have been sent by our audience. So we probably want to move into the discussion on third parties. So we leave a few minutes for addressing the questions we have in front of us.
Sounds good. So on the confidence on third parties, majority of the CISOs indicate that they are only somewhat confident in their third parties' cybersecurity practices. And if you look at the next slide in terms of what are the measures that the states are taking to improve that, the top two seems to be still related to addressing cybersecurity issues in a contract or signing confidentiality and non-disclosure agreements. And this one certainly seems to be an area where the CISOs may have to take the position of trust your third parties, but verify on a frequent basis may be the way to go. It looks like, and while that's definitely increasing in terms of monitoring and of the control access to the system data, but really doing auditing of the third-party risk might be something that the state CISOs may want to consider embarking on.
And we think this is very important. That's why we've asked this set of questions in previous surveys, simply because, as I mentioned, the continued evolution of the business model for IT delivery within the states is moving more and toward more for a public-private or a hybrid model where you have lots of third-party providers. And again, this is not necessarily technology provider. They could be business process outsourcing. They could be simply contractors and a variety of other service spaces, not necessarily technology, but they have access to, or at least they're working within the IT space. And I think that's important. So I guess, Debbie, I'm interested if you kind of look across the constellation of what's going on in the executive branch. What's your level of confidence around your third-party providers, and how do you focus on in terms of managing the adequacy of their cybersecurity practices?
Yeah, that's a great question, because our confidence level kind of runs the gamut. We certainly have service providers that we're very confident in the way that they're securing the services they're providing for us, but we also have others that we have very little confidence. And I actually was successful last year in getting funding to kind of build out more of a proactive risk assessment team for the state of Colorado. And part of it was so that we could go and start looking more at our third parties and doing sort of vendor risk management. But yeah, the other problem that we have is kind of getting our arms around how many service providers do we actually have that are providing services for the state, because, within the agencies, it's really easy for them to use, a credit card and go sign up for services. And we don't know about it until, suddenly we discover some sensitive data that is someplace where we didn't realize it was. And so that's got to be part of the problem, or part of the solution as well, is there has to be some sort of a gating process that when an agency goes and signs up for services, that somehow that gets onto our radar as well, so that we can ensure that, that the appropriate security is in place.
Yes. So again, an area that's going to require continued attention by our states. So Srini, if we could, let's jump into our last two topics. That first one is a quick overview of privacy and chief privacy officers in the states.
Sure. Really two takeaways here. Only 14 of the states have a chief privacy officer, and most of the states really lack an enterprise-level privacy program. I mean, sure, a number of large agencies like Health and Human Services agencies have a privacy officer at that level. But the question was really at the enterprise level, at the state executive branch level, if there was a chief privacy officer. And so we continue to track this data since 2010. There has been an improvement, but the question is it going to help to have a chief privacy officer? And the last one is related to identity and access management, mainly because most of the states reported that the most visible audit finding is in the access control domain. And when we look at the number of states with an enterprise identity solution, it's only about 21 of the states talk about having or in the process of implementing an enterprise solution. And of those 21 states, a number of initiatives are related to the multi-factor authentication and those kind of things. And the question here is, well, as the states are embracing a digital strategy in the continuing topic of our innovation, should identity or digital identity be the fabric of that innovation for states embracing a digital strategy?
Yeah, good point, Srini. And Debbie, I know that you rolled out a multi-factor authentication initiative in Colorado more than a couple of years ago. So you can tell me, perhaps our audience would like to get a minute about that initiative in Colorado.
Yeah, and we are one of those states that uses Google G Suite. And so we implemented multi-factor authentication for G Suite specifically, but we are also one of the states that is now implementing a identity and access management tool set across all agencies to help automate the provisioning, deprovisioning, and auditing across all agency user accounts. And so I was kind of surprised that only 21 states were doing this, but I do understand because this is probably the most expensive and the most complex and challenging project that we are going to do, because trying to solve identity for all of the executive branch agencies, it's a heavy lift. But I'm really excited that, the legislature chose to fund this, but we had to go ask for a lot of money in order to get this done.
Yeah, I'll just say two things that as we see major constraints in MFA and just really enterprise IAM, and that's legacy systems. So that's all I'll say. That's a challenge. So,
Yes,
so
it is.
before we end, we've got a couple of minutes here. We've got a couple of substantive questions around, particularly one around, could we comment on the role of cybersecurity issues related to the CISO and the general counsel and other legal staff within the organization? So, how do they interact? Obviously, from the privacy standpoint, we see a lot of that, but on the security standpoint, certainly, Debbie, can you talk about that interaction and perhaps even with the risk model with the general counsels or other legal staff?
Yeah, that's one of the areas that we've identified that we'd like to have a closer working relationship because we don't interact with our Attorney General's office as much as we should. And even in cybersecurity incidents, the most that we do with them is just run our communication strategy and what we intend to communicate through that team. But I do think we need to improve upon that relationship significantly.
Yeah, so and I think I would agree with that. In other states, we've seen a little more, particularly for those general counsels and others within a risk office within the state. We're seeing a little more interaction there, but certainly not what we would see in the private sector. In many large private sector corporations, the chief information security officer has actually been moved into the risk office and outside of the technology domain, which is kind of interesting. So a second question we have really gets to the kind of the training and the ongoing capabilities within the organizations. I'll summarize at universities are great, but kind of limited at the moment of time and lag behind the kind of training and education. So what is the role of the private sector in continuous training in terms of the states, perhaps partnering with the states on keeping up to that on a regular basis? And I know many states do use private sector learning management providers for cybersecurity, so I can answer part of that because we know states do subscribe to those services and also subscribe to other type of what I'll call SaaS cloud services for security testing, things like phishing exercises. So many states have contracts with the private sector to do that. So I guess, Debbie, I'm interested in your specific answer to that, and then Srini, from your national view, how are states leveraging private sector in terms of training and awareness for their state employees?
Yeah, we're definitely leveraging private sector mainly. So we have an LMS and then we buy content. We also have an IT training portal that we've discovered has a lot of security content as well. And then we do develop a little bit internally to meet specific needs. But I would say mainly we're buying content from the private sector.
And Doug, I would add to that, in the survey, we found that training and awareness programs is one of the most mature aspects of what the CISOs are doing across the states. And the CISOs have certainly embraced collaboration with private sector on that, either getting the content, the systems, and rolling the training out. And in the recent trend that we are also seeing is the state-level CISOs are expanding the scope of training beyond the executive branch and employees of the state to the counties, local governments, and even in some cases higher education as well. So the training and awareness is definitely an area that's been the top of the mind for the CISOs and has a good level of maturity already.
Well, I thank everybody. We are out of time. Appreciate Debbie, Srini, and Doug for your moderation. Great information here. And again, just as a reminder, the report can be found on NASCIO's website, and you see that on the screen there, and then also our contact information on the next screen if you'd like to get in touch with any of us. Thank you all for joining today. The recording will also be available on NASCIO's website. Thanks so much.